Assalamu alaikum. You're watching PTV World and I'm Faisal Rehman with the special transmission on this very important OIC conference that is being held in Islamabad. And as we all know, the main reason is about the Afghan crisis. So this is in fact the largest gathering after the 15th of August when the Taliban they took over the regime in Afghanistan. Now, as we all know, the winter has approached. There are a lot of crises, whether we talk about the economic upset that is there or we talk about the banking collapse. There is lack of flow of money. So the government in Afghanistan currently can't even pay the salaries of the government employees. And having said that, the crisis is so huge that it is believed that 60% of the total population of Afghanistan is at the verge of almost starvation. There is no medical facilities as such, and people are really depending on the neighboring countries such as Pakistan and Iran perhaps, and in the northern side, the CS countries as well. But having said that, now the issue is so huge that Pakistan in fact took the initiative and called the OIC members to attend this very important summit so that this particular issue could be taken care of. As we all know, the Western world isn't supporting as such. The Americans, they have frozen their 9.5 billion US dollars, and that was much needed for the revival of their economy. And so the case is from a lot of European countries as well. In fact, they initially pledged for help, but nothing has arrived so far. As we will be in fact continuing this transmission for the next 3 days till Sunday. So this is the beginning in fact, and let us show you a report that our production team has prepared. And after that, I'll introduce you to our panelists and we'll start the conversation.
A deepening humanitarian quandary of Afghanistan reflects the flawed approach of international community towards Afghanistan with tragic consequences. The crumbling healthcare system, economic meltdown of aid-dependent economy, pandemic, food insecurity exacerbated by drought and harsh winter all combined to create a perfect storm for killing more Afghans than bullets. Raising further alarm, the UN envoy for Afghanistan, Deborah Loynes, said an estimated 60% of Afghanistan's 38 million people are facing crisis level of hunger in a food emergency that will likely worsen over the winter.
Now is not the time to turn away from the Afghan people. We must find ways to prevent an imminent humanitarian catastrophe and the terrible loss of life that could happen over the winter.
According to UNICEF, around 3.2 million Afghan children are acutely malnourished and 1.1 million children are at risk of dying because of severe acute malnutrition unless we intervene with treatment. Explaining the country's worst humanitarian disaster, Abdullah al-Dardari, the resident representative of the UNDP in Afghanistan, some 23 million people are in desperate need of food. The $20 billion economy could shrink by $4 billion or more, and 97% of the 38 million population are at risk of sinking into poverty. As an emphatic gesture, Pakistan has announced $28 million medical, food and other humanitarian assistance for Afghanistan, while also authorizing the transport of food aid from India through Pakistan to Afghanistan. The ensuing catastrophe is preventable as releasing the frozen funds, the Afghan Central Bank's $9 billion reserves, most of which are held in the US, would alleviate the current humanitarian crisis. UNICEF official Samantha Mort noted that this is not time for political brinkmanship. People in Afghanistan are dying and they need our support. Humanitarian aid is the last expression of human solidarity.
And now to talk about it, let me introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio on my right is Ma'am Naila Chuhan. She is a former ambassador, senior diplomat. Ma'am, thank you so much for your time. And we also have Lieutenant General retired Talat Masood Saab, who's a senior analyst. Sir, thank you so much, Elsa, for your time as well. And on Skype, we have with us from Germany, Helga Zepp Larouche. She's the founder of Schiller Institute. Thank you so much, Helga Zepp, for your time as well. Pleasure to have you on the show. But let me start off from you, General Saab, if you allow me, sir. Sir, OIC's extraordinary meeting on Afghanistan, great initiative by a country like Pakistan. Obviously, we expect a lot to be done. Hopes and expectations versus the reality, sir. Now, since we all know the kind of influence the United States of America has on certain Gulf countries as well as in general on the Muslim countries, sir, if they are not willing, if they're not ready to release a sum of, let's say, 9.5 billion, which is urgently needed in Afghanistan. This is primarily about the food security, about the shortage of medicine. It's about the harsh winter. And as you heard, that 3.2 million children are practically starving. 1.1 million could die during this time period if the help doesn't arrive on time. So, Jalsab, do you think the Muslim Ummah, as we say, is in a position to take a decision in favor of the current regime against the will and the wish of the Americans?
Well, I think the Americans should be ashamed of themselves, really. I mean, I'm talking of the government in the sense that, look, I mean, what they have done by having this sort of an embargo, what they are denying the poor people of Afghanistan, the children of Afghanistan, the women of Afghanistan, and those men who are really more or less starving, you know. So they want 60%, or then it will get even worse, and a time would come then when you would find that 90% of the Afghans are without any food and without any shelter. So I think I just cannot understand that America, which genuinely has at times been extremely a great benefactor and has been giving assistance, you know, to one of the most sort of deserving sort of places, now imposes a restriction and tries to punish the poor people of Afghanistan for, you know, because the government is that of Taliban. Well, I mean, they were negotiating with the Taliban. There was no reason why on earth they should have really imposed this penalty. But having said that, I think this the question that you have posed to me is genuinely, I think Pakistan is doing a great job in the sense that it is assembling and trying to put the full weight of the Islamic countries so that, you know, the voice is heard more effectively around the world, because the world is at the moment not much pushed about Afghanistan. And I think then there is also a possibility that the Muslim countries or the Islamic group will also probably contribute in a way that at least it could elevate the immediate and look after the immediate needs of the Afghans. And this is what they should be doing, that there should be an emergency fund, I think, that they have to raise. If they would raise that emergency fund and that is given to these people, and then it is also seen that you know, the food supplies and other things which are essential for their survival, and I think they also need some clothing, you know, because the winter is so severe in Afghanistan. So I think I feel that this was a good move on the part of Pakistan to have assembled the Muslim countries, because just Pakistan and Iran raising their voice is not enough.
Ma'am, your take on the same point, in fact.
Yes, I totally agree with our wise senior General Sahib. It is very true. It is a very complex situation in Afghanistan. Humanitarian issue is the primary issue at this moment.
Correct.
But in Afghanistan, it's, you know, I would say 4 dimensions of the problem, like you alluded to in your introduction as well, that there's an economic crisis, there's a financial crisis, there's a social crisis, and of course the political one. Put them all together. And Pakistan from the day one said that we would have a regional approach to it as far as the recognition of the Taliban is concerned. And until that is done, the Western countries are unlikely to give their financial or economic support to Afghanistan. So now politics and economics have got intermingled. And Pakistan is pursuing its approach to put the regional countries and then the Islamic countries together to find a solution pending establishment of a formal government in Afghanistan. Because at this moment it is an interim government, and it is difficult for the rest of the world to recognize an interim government, and until they recognize it, they're unlikely to give their assistance to them.
When you say it's an interim government, people do not even use the word government. They say
Yeah,
it's a regime.
exactly. I agree.
But the point is, ma'am, do you think that this particular summit that is being held in Islamabad, they'll be able to come up with some sort of a solution where the Western world in particular, because they matter and they matter the most, they'll be able to say, let's suppose that this current regime is acceptable, but these are the conditions. Because whatever they could have done, they have been doing it actually. They have got so much happening in Afghanistan, whether you talk about the terrorism activities by the non-state actors, or perhaps the financial crunch they are going through, lack of food security, and ma'am, people are practically living on the roads. I was reading an article in which they stated that 20,000 Hazara people are living in the outskirts of only Kabul. And imagine the severe weather you're talking about. It's unbelievable. You can't live in a tent in that kind of weather, ma'am.
Not everybody has a tent even, so the conditions are really dire there. I agree with you. I'm sorry I used the word regime, but government, but it's basically an arrangement, I would say. We haven't really cooked up a term for it yet. But the thing is that will OIC foreign ministers meeting come up with a solution? It is difficult to predict, because the OIC, as you know, comprises different countries from different regions which have different priorities. So it is Pakistan's earnest hope that as part of the Ummah we can come up with a solution which is to save the lives in Afghanistan, because that
primarily
is
it's a humanitarian crisis.
Exactly,
and one has to take certain steps where people could be saved. At the end of the day, this is exactly like that. I still remember when as a kid, when the Soviet Union, they invaded Afghanistan, and there were a lot of people who migrated to Pakistan, and at the Eid time, I remember during that particular time period when Qurbani was being done, a lot of planes used to come from Saudi Arabia, and they would bring in meat for these people. So this is what we have seen during those crises, but currently it's more or less, even it's worse right now, but nothing is being done. But let's see what Ms. Helga Zepp has to share with us. Now ma'am, looking at the current Afghan crisis and the summit that Pakistan is having in Islamabad, now your take, I mean, what sort of hope do you have about the Afghan people that yes, there is going to be some sort of help in terms of cash and kind, both, ma'am?
Well, first of all, I think it's extremely important what Pakistan is doing right now by hosting the summit. I have a terrible echo here. By Pakistan taking the leadership in a situation where the West has morally completely failed. I mean, this is a moral bankruptcy declaration, because this is not a crisis which was not foreseeable, because, you know, already 1 week after the withdrawal of the US and NATO troops from Afghanistan, it was clear that the country was in a complete shambles. And now almost 4 months have passed since. And, you know, it is clear that more than 90% of the people are in danger of dying of hunger, of the cold in the freezing winter. And this has been known in the West for, you know, several months. But in the news, Afghanistan has completely disappeared from the Western media. So I think this conference is a real chance to show who is the moral superior factor in the situation. And I'm so ashamed that the West is not capable of, I mean, the money which is being withheld by the US Treasury and European banks, this money belongs to the Afghan people, and we are in a campaign right now with the Schiller Institute, both in the United States and in Western Europe, to demand that these monies be unfrozen right away. But I actually would like to mention something which is a little bit more hopeful element. I mean, I have called for Operation Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina was probably the most famous doctor in the history of mankind, the most famous physician. He lived about 1,000 years ago. And right now, to build a modern health system in Afghanistan would be, that would be the beginning of overcoming not only the humanitarian crisis, but at the same time also starting a real economic development. And to give that the name of Ibn Sina, it would bring forward, and I would actually hope that the OIC countries, being the Islamic countries of the world, that they would adopt Operation Ibn Sina if they all would work together, make Ibn Sina the synonym for not only saving the Afghan people right now in this incredible humanitarian crisis, but all working together to build up economically this country, which has a very proud history. It was once known, this whole region, as the land of the 1,000 cities. Ibn Sina is not just a physician, but he was one of the great universal thinkers who contributed a lot to philosophy and many areas of knowledge. So I think this is a moment where history can be shaped in a positive way. So I think the West has failed, and now hopefully the Islamic countries, together with the neighbor countries of Afghanistan, can step in. And this is, I mean, it's unbelievable what is happening. I mean, that the world would know such a humanitarian tragedy and not act. I think this is a point people have to really think, what does that mean about the moral condition of the world? I think the Operation Ibn Sina could be a tremendous change in the situation.
Now, Jalsa very rightly pointed out. I mean, she's some couple of very interesting points that the lady has raised. First of all, sir, when we talk about the current Afghan crisis, they are beyond imagination, to be very honest, because just imagine there is no food, there is no money, harsh weather, and on top, nobody is ready to support you. So the Americans, they have always, championed the statement that we will liberate countries, and mostly they have tried to liberate the Muslim countries, and they ended up creating the worst chaos there. You talk about Syria, you talk about Iraq, Afghanistan, and so you exactly know what I'm talking about. So perhaps, if they were there to liberate and they ended up spending 2.2 trillion according to them, and interestingly, only a few families, in fact, eventually benefited from these. But the point now is that if the Americans are not willing to accept the regime of the Taliban, perhaps they are trying to put pressure on them and they want to talk to them from a position of strength. Are they actually getting that position of strength, or do you believe that without the support of the West, the OIC, and along with certain other countries like Chinese perhaps, or the Russians, they can look after the issue to a certain extent, sir?
No, I think it's very important that the West, and especially the US, must recognize firstly the level of catastrophe that is taking place in Afghanistan. They must help Afghanistan because they owe it to them. Because you see, the thing is that they invaded Afghanistan, and that by itself is they should make them very guilty conscious of it, because it was not the fault of the Afghan people. Osama bin Laden was there, but Osama bin Laden's presence doesn't mean that 220 million or 23 million people should suffer so much for so many years.
And once they believe that they have been successful in eliminating Al-Qaeda and killing Osama bin Laden. It's been over 10 years now.
Yeah, and if that was the measure of their success, and what about the other failures that have happened in Afghanistan and because of their policies? So I am convinced that unless America changes its policy, the Western countries will also be very hesitant in changing their policy towards Afghanistan. So I think at least they should allow the European countries to sort of contribute and make some sort of a difference in what is happening. Now, one thing is good, that they are at least channeling something through these aid agencies and so on. But this is no substitute for giving to the government. You have to give it to the government. As far as the quality of governance is concerned, well, you can put pressure. That may be good for the people of Afghanistan as well. But this does not mean that it should be so conditional that the very people for whom you are trying to advocate, they themselves are suffering so much. And then I think it's extremely important for the Islamic countries to sort of really use their influence, whatever little influence they have over the Western countries and especially America. And collectively, if they sort of really raise their voice, I think it will have much
But the question is, perhaps only those countries can help who are in a position to help.
Yeah, like Saudi Arabia
or
UAE and all.
G6 countries, Gulf countries in particular. But sir, we all know the kind of pressure the Americans have on them, sir. I remember that Saudi Arabia and UAE, they were the first two countries along with Pakistan to accept the regime of the Taliban at that time. But currently, sir, we haven't heard much from them. Do you think they'll be able to deliver? To what extent, if so?
No, I think, the same logic that we are applying to Americans, we also should apply to the Muslim countries, irrespective of the fact, even Pakistan is not happy with all the policies that the Taliban are pursuing. And neither is Iran, neither is China, and neither is Russia. So that does not mean that they are not really prepared to support the people of Afghanistan. And they don't want the poor people of Afghanistan to suffer. And because you see, it is not only that the people of Afghanistan are suffering and Afghanistan is suffering, but it has very serious consequences for the entire region. And we have gone through that experience, that when Afghanistan is in trouble, the whole world is in trouble. But more so, the neighboring countries are in trouble.
They suffer the most.
And we have already seen what is happening now in Pakistan. Firstly, we are getting a flood of refugees in Iran and Pakistan. Then at the same time, we are also getting, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and this, that and the other are getting activated. What does that mean? That means it is becoming a playground for all these forces which are inimical to, and then, there will be also a lot of drug smuggling and drug mafias all becoming very, very strong.
And very
so
active.
I think that cycle which was existing in the past will be repeated.
Ma'am, now this is what suits the West, doesn't it? That turmoil in Afghanistan, the Indians very categorically believe that if the situation remains fluid in Afghanistan, that suits us, because that is going to affect Pakistan in a negative way. This is their policy, and openly they admit that. Whether you talk about their external affairs minister, or you talk about Mr. Rajnath Singh, the defense minister, or even the Prime Minister Modi. So A. Secondly, ma'am, when you talk about the regional countries or the region getting affected, this definitely is going to affect OBOR, BRI, CPEC and all, and that again suits the Americans. So the equation pretty much is tilted towards them, isn't it?
I wouldn't say the situation is tilted towards them, but I agree with you that there is an agenda there of having controlled chaos. Indians are definitely not interested in having that kind of stability in Afghanistan, and so are the Americans, because if they were interested in real peace and stability in that country, they wouldn't have left in the haste that they did.
Absolutely.
So that we are not going to debate. What we are going to debate is how to deal with the situation that we are confronted with. And it is in the, on the priority of the immediate neighbors like Pakistan, Iran and the Central Asian republics, also China and Russia and the Gulf countries, to find solution to this problem because humanitarian issue is of course the primary, but then it spills over into other problems that can affect our own stability. So it is imperative that we find solution which is acceptable to the Afghans, because Afghans never like to take dictates. It has to be Afghan owned and Afghan led, but we have to encourage them and help them. So step one is the humanitarian, and then encourage them to have political stability, which would then facilitate other, solution of other problems.
Ma'am, when you say Afghan led and Afghan owned, don't you think this regime is actually Afghan owned and Afghan led? Because Taliban, they were constantly putting pressure on the Americans, if you remember, ma'am, and eventually the talks, they took place in Doha. Certain countries took the initiative. Pakistan did its level best to engage the Americans and the Taliban, and eventually this was a solution. But nobody expected that the Americans will just run away one fine night and eventually end up blaming Pakistan and making us the scapegoat, because it was their failure, not ours, ma'am. 2.2 trillion is not a joke. If they have spent that kind of money and eventually handed over the Taliban regime to the Taliban regime after 20 years and after killing so many people, what is that supposed to mean?
No, I agree with you. But the point is that when I'm saying Afghan led and Afghan owned, I'm basically talking about an inclusive decision making process. Of course, Talibans are Afghans, but within Talibans also there are groupings.
Various factions.
Various factions. So that fragmentation in that polity itself is challenging for the rest of the world to deal with, particularly the Afghans themselves. But if they come up with some inclusive solution where all Afghans are represented, I mean ethnicities.
The Tajiks, the Uzbeks,
yes.
the Pashtuns, they should have their own,
They should have their voice in the decision making process. That's when it would be really Afghan led and Afghan owned, because then it's all Afghans, it's not just a particular group that's leading, and that particular group has to understand the importance of inclusivity as in representation of all ethnicities.
Now, very interesting point. Now, let me take this debate to the lady in Germany. Ms. Helga, now a couple of important points. One is when Mr. Hamid Karzai was brought in, nobody knew him. And he was there for 2 terms because he was the blue-eyed boy of the Americans. Certainly when he made certain remarks and he was pretty open, then there was this, I would say, change as far as the leadership is concerned. Then 2 terms were given to Mr. Ashraf Ghani, who ended up running away, leaving the Afghan people. And interesting part was that in every election, it was believed that they were rigged, and they were so close that initially Abdullah was made, the foreign minister, and later on again, since he was also running for the campaign of the presidentship, he said, well, I'm the president, and ended up becoming the CEO. And again, then in the second term, he was again given another responsibility. Now, the point is, if that is acceptable to the Americans, that Mr. John Kerry flies all the way from USA, comes here, creates a new appointment and settle down things. If that is acceptable, ma'am, why is the Taliban regime not acceptable to the Americans? Is it because they are ashamed of their loss in Afghanistan, or perhaps they never expected Taliban to take charge so quickly, within days in fact?
Well, obviously it is a shameful experience. I mean, the United States military is the strongest military on the planet, and combined with NATO, I mean, there is simply no other military force stronger. And to be defeated by essentially 65,000 Taliban fighters is not exactly a heroic experience. I think some of the military who were involved are still licking their wounds, and they have a hard time to digest the fact that they really suffered an incredible defeat. But that doesn't take away the responsibility. I mean, you cannot go, I mean, in the history of military affairs, if you defeat an enemy, you have a certain responsibility for what happens. In the same way, even if you lose, the fact that the West, NATO and the United States and the German Bundeswehr and many others were for 20 years in Afghanistan fighting, gives them a moral responsibility to deal with the people. And what is happening now by sanctioning Afghanistan, by withholding the funds, they are punishing the Afghan people. The Taliban, in a certain sense, the argument that the Taliban are not respecting women's rights, that may be true, but, if you starve more than 90% of the population, you are doing much worse to the women. And, the pictures of the dying children and dying babies, I would really like that these pictures should haunt the people who are withholding their help. This is bordering genocide because, the effects are all known. The withholding of the money right now, it's the biggest crime I can imagine. So I think we have to really arouse the world public much more, because what you do by doing this, you force the Taliban practically to go back to the drug production and drug trade. The Taliban do not want to have drug production. It goes against their religious beliefs. And, in 2000, the UN representative Pino Arlaki was negotiating with the Taliban, and they gave up the drug production. The explosion of drugs occurred after NATO came back in the country. And now, by withholding the funds, you are forcing the Taliban to get money from somewhere. So this will have incredible amount of deaths in Europe, in Russia, in China, where the drugs will find their way to go. It also will mean that you encourage, if you say you have to have an opposition to the Taliban, well, you are encouraging terrorism. The refugee crisis. If this is not remedied very quickly, you will have millions of people trying to escape hunger and starvation and the cold. So you will have a tremendous refugee crisis, which will burden the neighbor countries. But, these refugees will then try to get to Turkey or to Europe. And, it's just, there is no explanation for what is happening now, which would have any rationale and any justification. So I think, hopefully this conference taking place in Pakistan right now, also would find an appeal to the rest of the world, to open their eyes, because what is at stake, these are the kinds of branching points, where you either go in the direction of, becoming more human or becoming more barbarian. And right now, the West clearly has decided on the latter. And I think that has to be remedied.
Ma'am, according to our foreign minister, the Afghan interim foreign minister is also going to attend this moot, along with the Chinese delegation and the Russian as well as the American. Now, since the American presence would be there, ma'am, do you think that the OIC members, if they agree, let's suppose if they agree that countries like Saudi Arabia can provide fuel for a certain time, let's say for a year on deferred payments or something of that sort, few countries can, countries like Russia can provide wheat, because the wheat consumption is a lot in Afghanistan. So is the cases with rice. Certain countries, Pakistan might, let's suppose, end up agreeing that the Indians can bring in food supplies via Pakistan to Afghanistan. These decisions, because this is also going to be some sort of a negotiation, that if India wants to help, we would let them help. But there has to be some sort of a condition that this is the way it should be, because there is a lot of trust deficit also. Similarly, when we talk about this important point, that we're not saying that let's accept the regime, but at least talk to them. Do you think this is the basic point from where we can start the negotiation?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll just do so. Yeah, there you are. So, ma'am, since we were talking about, our foreign minister was in fact also throwing light on this very important aspect of humanitarian crisis, and he said, well, we will try our level best to sort this issue out. And he also said that he had a meeting with the Secretary General of OIC, which was very productive. Now, ma'am, one quick comment. I mean, as far as the media is concerned, since you were saying that there is no news about Afghanistan these days on the Western media, in Europe in particular, is the story regarding this particular moot where the OIC members are meeting in Islamabad, is that also a story in your television channels, or rather in the papers or on the net?
No, the coverage of Afghanistan has practically disappeared. I mean, there was a big upset in the immediate aftermath after the troops went out, and for 3-4 weeks it was a big issue. But since 3 months in Italy, in France, in Germany, you don't find any coverage at all. I think if one follows the media from the region, there are a lot of very promising signs. For example, I thought that the fact that India and Pakistan agreed to use the Pakistan route transport food from India, I think this was a very important step. And, I know for India, what happens in Afghanistan is also extremely important. So one could only wish that the regional cooperation is overcoming older geopolitical conflicts. Also, naturally, the meetings which took place in the Central Asian republics involving Russia, China. But I think this question of the extended troika should also be pushed, because I think the involvement of the United States in a constructive effort, I mean, that in my view is the breaking issue, because if the United States could be convinced to take a positive attitude, it would be an extremely important stepping stone for an otherwise extremely dangerous geopolitical confrontation between the United States and Russia and China. So in a certain sense, to get all the forces internationally together to help Afghanistan is, in my view, one of the absolute important historical missions. In a certain sense, I think the whole destiny of mankind sort of is in a laser, concentrated on what happens in Afghanistan. So I would really hope that all the participating and affected countries would double and multiply their efforts to really make the saving of Afghanistan an issue of the whole world, because right now it is not. I think all channels must be used, media, United Nations, conferences. There must be a drumbeat, there must be a drumbeat of awakening the conscience of the world, because I think this is sort of a judgment of our ability as a human species to, are we morally fit to survive or not? So in one sense, I think the fate of Afghanistan and the fate of humanity are much more closely connected than most people can imagine.
Very well said, ma'am. Very well said. And I would, in fact, close this particular segment of our transmission on this note, Jil Saab and ma'am, that when we talk about Mr. Joe Biden, the US president, he thinks that he is the champion of humanitarian crisis. And he always talks about the issues all over the world, but doesn't speak much about Kashmir or Palestine for that matter. Neither we have heard much from him regarding Afghanistan. But I think this is the high time that all the human beings are created equal. So I think this is something really important, and the Americans should take a lead if they consider themselves as the globe leaders or the masters in that matter. They should definitely come up with some sort of a solution, a proper remedy for this issue. But Jal Saab, thank you so much for your presence, and ma'am, it was a pleasure having you. Thank you so much. We'll just take a short break here. After the break, we'll return and we'll continue our transmission. Stay with us. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our transmission. Since we're talking about this very important OIC moot that is being held in Islamabad to make sure that the humanitarian issues should be taken care of that are posing a significant threat to the public of Afghanistan. As we all know that they have the social issue, they have their economic problems, they have the bank which is at a verge of a collapse. Their accounts, they've been frozen. $9.5 billion of the Afghan people that is being held in the United States of America and other Western countries, that has been frozen and not released. There is acute shortage of food, and it is believed that 60% of the total population is at a verge of an absolute catastrophe when it comes to it. 1.1 million children can die if there is no appropriate help available at the right time, plus around 3.2 million children, again I would say, are at a verge of starvation. So a lot of issues are going on, and Pakistan has taken this initiative to in fact have this moot in Islamabad, so that the issue of Afghanistan should be raised and the Muslim countries should come forward and help the Afghan people. Now in our second portion of our transmission, we have been joined in by Lieutenant General retired Raza Muhammad Khan Sahab, who's a senior analyst. Jan Sahab, pleasure to have you on the show, sir. And we also have with us Naghmana Hashmi Saiba, senior diplomat and former ambassador. Ma'am, pleasure to have you in the show as well. And from Stockholm, Sweden, we've been joined by Hussein Askary Sahab, who's an expert on international relations. Pleasure to have you, Askary Sahab. Thank you so much for your time also. But let me start off from you, General Sahab. Earlier, we were having General Talat Masood and Ma'am Naila Chuhan, the former ambassador, and we were talking about the overall emerging situation, sir. And honestly speaking, when you look at the numbers, the facts and the figures and the stories that are coming out of Afghanistan, it seems that there is a lot of problem out there, and the people are suffering just because the American regime or the Western bloc is not supporting them. Though they will be representing through their special representatives in Pakistan. But a lot of people do believe that as long as the Western world is not going to support the current regime, I'm not talking about the acceptance of the regime, but talking about the support for this regime, for the time being, nothing is going to happen. Even this OIC moot cannot yield those kind of results which we all are expecting at the moment. Your take, Jan Sahab, on this.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think the answer to your question actually lies in the ultimate outcome of the OIC's parleys and meetings. I'd like to add to that this morning, there was a news item from a Russian news agency that the Troika Plus is going to meet again in Pakistan soon after the meeting of the OIC. So I think this, along with the fact that the conference on the 19th of the OIC countries is really now an international conference by virtue of the participation of the UN, the international financial organizations, particularly the World Bank, then the P5 countries, and then a number of other countries like Japan, Australia, and a few others. And I think I was just reading about half an hour back that the foreign minister was saying that the special representatives of Russia, China, and Afghanistan, they would all be here in this OIC's conference on special invitation. So that gives it, I think, a very important role. And the foreign minister was also saying that this meeting is there to remove the communication gap between the Western world and the interim government of the Taliban, who are going to be represented by their interim foreign minister. So what you were saying, that it becomes the obligation essentially of the OIC. If you look at the 5 major components of the OIC mandate or their charter, then helping and assisting all Muslim countries of the world, particularly when they have a humanitarian problem or if there are disasters there, it is a very important obligation of the OIC, and I hope that this will become a test case for the OIC itself, because so far since 15th August, the OIC has been in the background, and I think serious questions have been raised on the role of the OIC when many foreign governments they have actually pledged and some have committed money to obviate this disaster situation that you made a mention of in Afghanistan. And it is very obvious that God forbid if Afghanistan becomes a failed state, then it is not only going to threaten the entire population of Afghanistan, out of which 60% according to the UN estimates are hungry, they are less clothed, and the issue of the ISIS and the terrorists also there. So economic migration from Afghanistan to its neighboring countries.
It has already started. 19,000 people have entered Pakistan since 15th of August.
And many would go to because now Pakistan and both Iran they have got the fencing. So it will be difficult for them to enter Pakistan. So where are they going to go? They are going to go north from the Central Asian republics, and maybe a little bit because the Iranian border is also not fully fenced. So from Iran to Europe and to many other countries of the world. And similarly, I think terrorism in all its forms and manifestations is going to restart. So it is going to pose a threat to the region, to Afghanistan, to Afghanistan's neighbors, to Europe, to the United States, and all its helpers and supporters. So one can only hope that this conference leads towards a solution of the problem, and I think the leading solution should be that the frozen assets of the people of Afghanistan, I am not talking of the government of Afghanistan, needs to be unfrozen and given back to them
on ASCP basis
as soon as possible. At the same time, I think the affluent countries of the OIC, they have an obligation to immediately release and donate funds to the government and to the people of Afghanistan so that they can start running the country normally.
All right. Now, Jal Saab has pointed out a couple of very important points, ma'am. He said that, but this is the ideal case, that Muslim countries, they take the initiative, and countries, especially in the Gulf, they end up accumulating a certain sum of money, or perhaps they could, like countries like Saudi Arabia or Qatar, or
UAE.
Kuwait and UAE itself, I mean, they could help them not only in cash but also in kind, and at the same time, for example, deferred payments of oil should be made or something of that sort. Because when you look at the regional countries, whether it's Pakistan or Iran, ma'am, they do not have the capacity to help to that level, because they have their own economic issues at hand. Now, ma'am, just throw light on the parameters of success as far as this mood is concerned. After 3 days, what exactly do you expect them to do?
Well, that's a $1 million question for a very simple reason that so far, if I'm correct, I read this morning that there are only 24 OIC countries out of 57 attending. I think that is less than half.
33 are not attending?
33 are not attending, unless the list increases in the next day or two. So that itself, I think, is a little worrisome, because OIC, I remember when the jihad started against the Soviet Union, OIC was in the forefront, and the Muslim countries, particularly the affluent ones, did come forward and fund the jihad and supported it because it was a Muslim country under aggression, foreign aggression. But over the years we have seen that OIC has really, as General Saab said, been in the background, not only in Afghanistan, in some other issues also which directly involve the Muslim world. There is a lot of geopolitics and geoeconomics behind it that this is not the time to discuss, but there is that feeling that OIC has really not pulled its weight. So this is, I think, a test of the credibility of OIC as an organization, because 57 Muslim countries, half of whom are very affluent, and they have a very good degree of influence and relations with the West as well, with the powers that be. So I think now is the time that these countries should exert their influence and ensure that the voice of the OIC is heard by the people that matter in this situation. And it is, of course, a very grim situation. It is very good for people to announce financial aid and everything, but the issue here is not just of collecting funds. The problem here is that there are still UN sanctions on business, on the Taliban. There is still, the frozen assets. So unless pressure is exerted on the US and on the other powers,
pressure is exerted on US. Let's define the statement.
No, because
who can influence them?
I think,
who can persuade them? Let me use the right word.
I think a joint voice, a very strong joint voice of OIC, plus I think a joint effort by the regional countries, because unless those sanctions are lifted, unless there is a mechanism that is put in place to ensure that the Afghan government can trade and can function normally. There is no banking system there yet. You can't make bank transactions into Afghanistan. So maybe there could be a possibility of putting in an interim, maybe a 2-year package of something where maybe countries like Pakistan are allowed to have their bank branches through which humanitarian assistance and package transactions could be done. Because just collecting money which cannot go into Afghanistan or be transferred there, it will not make any difference. Therefore, I think what the need, and if the OIC can do that, forget about the long term. Right now, you actually need an intermediate package of assistance and hand-holding right away. It is, the situation in Afghanistan is beyond politics. It is now about saving the people of Afghanistan. And I think the West is unfortunately making the same mistake that they had made in 92, in the 90s, that they are abandoning Afghanistan. Nobody is saying you recognize the Taliban, but you have to look at the people of Afghanistan. Because the people, they say a hungry man is an angry man. And the Afghans are not only hungry, they're feeling betrayed, not only by the Muslim countries, but also by the powers that they have fought with, or they have worked with also, during the past. So it is that sense of frustration, that hunger, that lack of a future. They can't. I mean, they're selling their children.
Uncertainty, basically.
There's uncertainty, and all they are looking down is a dark barrel with no light at the end of this, of the tunnel. So this will actually lead to Afghanistan imploding from within, and who is going to suffer? First and foremost the people, then the region, then the rest of the world. So are we going to sit here and allow Afghanistan to once again sort of reel out of control, and we repeat the same history of the last 20 years? Can we afford that? Can the West afford that? So I think it is time to be a little bit sort of with a long-term vision and sagacity,
but as they say,
see this issue.
Where there is a will, there is a way. And I suppose the will seems to be missing as far as the United States is
I
concerned.
think the will is missing, but there I do see a little ray of hope because of the fact that Pakistan, as our foreign minister said, has been able to play that role of a bridge. We have been able to not only get the OIC to come and discuss and have the Taliban, give their point of view, but we have been able to persuade the P5, the financial institutions and other countries also to come and at least provide them a platform to listen and interact. There has to be a plan. So I think that provides me with a ray of hope, and I think it's been a very good initiative of the government of Pakistan, led by our foreign minister, to not only have I would call it an OIC plus mood, because it has the other stakeholders.
Russians
and the important, the Chinese are there, the Russians are there, the Americans are there. So I think this is a very good platform, and I would actually hope to see that at the end of this mood, your question was, that they come up with not a long term, but an immediate and a middle term, intermediate plan to see how they take the people out of this misery and how they put Afghanistan on track to development. Because look, there is not only the crisis of food or crisis of money, there is also a crisis of capacity, of deliverance. There's a governance gap there, because everybody who was a technocrat, bureaucrat, learned, they have left. And there is a huge capacity gap. Even if you provide them aid, there is a lack of capacity to build those programs and the projects that they can put to the international community or to the Muslim community to give them the money. So this is the time when countries like China, countries like Pakistan, who are very good at making development plans, to handhold them, to help them develop their development, their not only governance, but also their development capacity. They need teachers, they need doctors, they need healthcare. So I think there's so many areas. So if they can come up with a reasonable plan, going beyond the bias of Taliban that they have, the anti-Taliban bias.
Again, that is an ideal case scenario, ma'am.
It's an ideal case scenario, but the fact that they have at least agreed to use the OIC platform to try and bridge that gap of perception. Maybe this is a very good opportunity where, encouraged by the OIC countries,
Definitely.
the Taliban can make the kind of commitments that the international world wants to see to move forward.
Is a perfect
so
idea.
I think this
At
is a
least
very,
we should
very
also
good
hear what the
initiative.
Taliban, they have in their mind, what the world is thinking, where to negotiate and how to negotiate, because this is going to be more or less about the negotiation between the OIC and the Taliban. Now coming to you, Hussein Askary Saab, couple of points. $2.2 trillion being spent, wisely or otherwise, that's a separate question. 20 years of war in Afghanistan, and at the end of the day, millions of people got displaced, hundreds and thousands of them got killed. Around 55, 60 countries invaded. Not even one is there to support them now. So perhaps they were there to liberate, but they couldn't liberate. So from liberalization to starvation, 20 years, 2.2 trillion. What sort of an economic equation is this, sir? Let's throw light on it.
It's more like 6 trillion.
Askary Saab.
Also, your guests have correctly pointed to very important things, but I think Pakistan's efforts to alleviate the situation in Afghanistan are laudable. I read a letter written by Foreign Minister Mr. Qureshi, and he correctly pointed out that the dangers looming and the urgency of nations, both in the Islamic world but also internationally, to move quickly to both release the funds of the Afghan people. These funds, the $9.5 billion kept in, frozen in the United States and European banks, these belong to the Afghani nation. They don't belong to Taliban. And your foreign minister also correctly pointed to actually the fact that there are millions of people in Afghanistan are now thinking about taking their children and moving outside Afghanistan to Iran, Pakistan, wherever they could. And this would be an even greater humanitarian crisis. But the international institutions like the World Food Program and others have correctly pointed out that there are millions, 20 million at least people are threatened by starvation. And therefore, there should be a first step is to unfreeze the funds of the Afghan people, because that would be the quickest way to get food, medicine, and other needs for the Afghan people, in addition, of course, to the humanitarian aid. But that's primary. Now, the thing is, what we have seen in the, as you pointed out, that the crisis in Afghanistan is not caused by Taliban takeover. It is caused by 20 years of failures of the transatlantic world, with trillions of dollars spent only on military operations, security operations. As your guest said, they failed to build the capacity in Afghanistan to produce food, to have decent health care, to have the basics of life produced inside Afghanistan. So this is a massive failure, and now we have this cynical game where, as your foreign ministers clearly pointed out, that if you now starve the Afghan people, which in itself is a crime actually against humanity, this collective punishment, what you will create is a chaotic security situation which will breed terrorism. It will breed mass immigration, the same things you claim to want to prevent. So this is a clear failure, but we are now mobilizing, actually, every effort should be made to resolve this situation, to get people in the United States and in Europe back to their senses. Our institute, the Schiller Institute, is involved in an international campaign to push the Congress, to push European politicians and governments, and humanitarian organizations are also supporting this effort to unfreeze the funds of Afghanistan people and start to work with the de facto government in Afghanistan, in Kabul, to start humanitarian aid. Now, the one important thing, which also your guests pointed out, which is related to the OIC, the Islamic nations have been split, but that was because we had an era of geopolitics which has just ended in Afghanistan. As even President Biden said, the withdrawal from Afghanistan marks the end of an era. Now, whatever he means by that, what we mean by that is that there is a new paradigm in international relations, the age of geopolitics, where you can pit one nation against the other to make geopolitical gains, not really any service to humanity. And in that geopolitical game of divide and conquer, Islamic nations, Muslim nations were pitted against each other, like in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, and it's continuing until today. So it is time that we move away from geopolitics, including all the Muslim nations. They should not be involved in this geopolitical game of divide and conquer, and unite their efforts to push the new paradigm, which is exemplified by the Belt and Road Initiative. The China-Pakistan economic corridor is the best vehicle to stretch the new Silk Road, this new strategy for reconstruction and win-win cooperation into Afghanistan. And all the neighbors of Afghanistan will benefit from this. The world will benefit from this. So this is the end of an era, and Muslim nations have to unite their efforts also with other non-Muslim nations, like, for example, we have in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So this will lead us into, as your guest says, both alleviating the immediate humanitarian crisis, but also pave the way to a long-term solution based on economic cooperation, building of infrastructure, and building a health platform, which our institute, as the chairman of our institute, have also discussed it on your television. We have Operation Ibn Sina to create, starting with Afghanistan and Yemen, a health care platform, which is based on building the necessary infrastructure, water, power, transport, education, and so on, to bring modern healthcare to the people. That's the only way nations in the East and the West can work together so we can close the chapter, the bloody chapter of geopolitics, which has extended now for 40 years, not only the last 20 years, and cost millions of lives. It caused massive misery, mass immigration, as you experienced yourself in Pakistan. So this is an opportunity as well as a crisis time. So we should seize the opportunity to unite the efforts, both of the Muslim nations, but also of the international community, to bring a more human solution to this situation.
Now, one quick comment before I have this word with the guests in the studio. Earlier, we had a guest from Germany, and she was mentioning that there is no news about Afghanistan in the Western media. And since you live in Scandinavia, and perhaps countries like Norway and even Sweden, or Denmark for that matter, Finland, these are the countries, I think they are the champions of humanitarian crisis and about the sufferings of the people. They always talk about it, they're very vocal. What is the current scenario? Is this moot being also talked about in the Western media, in particular in Scandinavia?
No, your guest from Germany was obviously correct. Afghanistan has disappeared from the media coverage. The only things which are reported are, people shedding crocodile tears over the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. But they ignore the fact that these actions, the sanctions against Afghanistan, are killing women and girls and children in Afghanistan. We have a few humanitarian organizations who actually have made public calls for relaunching the humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. So we have many Nordic organizations who have been involved in Afghanistan for many years. Now they are making public calls, and they get a limited coverage. But remember, now the governments and the elites here in Scandinavia, in Europe generally, but also in the United States, they are united now to focus on what they call, stopping China and Russia. Because those countries, who most of them in NATO, they failed in Afghanistan, but they want to shift the attention from their failure and the misery they have created in Libya, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on and so forth, to saying that we have the problems of the world are because you have two authoritarian regimes in Russia and China, and we have to stop them. And this is complete madness, because what we will get is a World War III, fought not by regular armies, it will be fought with nuclear weapons. And this is a recipe for the extinction of the human race. So those people in the media are supporting the war machine here, even in Scandinavia, to focus on how to fight and stop Russia and China. Now, Pakistan gets part of the blame on the situation here in the media, because they say Pakistan is supporting Taliban, and this is really evil propaganda.
Because at the end of the day, the narratives are always set by the Western world. And these are those narratives, in fact, sir. Jal Saab?
Yes. Now, just one thing that...
Please.
Narratives, yeah, but there is a reality on the ground. It is reality which will determine the outcome of things, not what people say in the media, not what these intelligence agencies are writing and sending it to the media to tell the people. There is a reality. The world has changed. The power of the world, the economic power of the world, have moved to the east. We have massive social and economic problems here in Europe. We have an electricity crisis right now here in Europe. We have a healthcare problem right here in Europe. So these realities will determine which way nations will go, not what these people in the military-industrial complex and their media agents are saying in the TV.
Perfectly said, perfectly said. Jal Saab, now the issue is that even the OIC countries, and I'll take the names, UAE, I mean, they have got great ties with Israel now. The Israeli Prime Minister for the first time visited UAE. So they are under a lot of Western influence also, sir. So the cases with Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince obviously understands about the importance of that case of the killing of Mr. Khashoggi. And he knows that Mr. Biden was so vocal when he was in fact running the campaign for the president. But now he hasn't said a word about that? Obviously, business matters, money matters, military industrial complexes earlier mentioned by Askary Saab, that matters. The only thing which doesn't matter, sir, are the moral values, ethics and norms, I would say. But sir, when you talk about the humanitarian crisis, whether it's your enemy, sir, you don't even think on those lines. But currently, sir, these people, so-called, the Americans were here to liberate them. Eventually, they created a disaster. And this is the history, sir. If you look at the last 100 years, wherever they have gone, they have created a mess, rather. So that means that either they were unable to, in fact, understand about the framework they had in their mind, or they were an absolute failure. Now blaming Pakistan for that, sir, because of the failures of the Americans in Afghanistan, saying that Taliban are being supported by the Pakistani government, or perhaps by the military, as they say. And now all these are being talked about in the Western world, women rights. If the women are alive only, then you can give them rights, sir. If people are starving, what rights are you talking about? The first right is to live. And that right is being practically snatched away by the Western world. Let me be very vocal, sir. Your take.
Okay, when we are talking about the formulation of foreign policies, then some people say, that this is essentially based on, realism and, the idealism is finishing. This may be so, in the West, but I think here in the East, there is still a lot of idealism. And, the best would be that it should be a combination of the two. After all, we are human beings, and I think this is what we appreciate. But leaving that aside, I'll refer now to, the blame game and to say who is responsible for their failures in Afghanistan. I think it was only yesterday when the former President Hamid Karzai, he has confessed and divulged that he was well aware that a very peaceful transition is going to happen in the month of the end of October or the beginning of August in Doha. And on the day, when Ashraf Ghani, when he left Afghanistan, he said that he himself was surprised.
He was unaware of it.
Unaware of it, and he started
That
calling
meeting in the morning.
Yeah, he started calling, the president's office and the NSA's office, the police chief office, the corps commander's office, and he says nobody was responding, and nobody was there, and he found out, that they had gone, and he said that then he personally contacted some of the Taliban leadership to come and take control, because otherwise there would be total chaos and looting would start. So I'm sure, the Americans have heard that, and after that admission, I think they should stop blaming others for that. So that is the first point I'd like to. The second point, about how to help Afghanistan. I think when the Americans and NATO ISAF was there, so there were at least 3 to 4 dozen international NGOs there, and they have their own banking systems. They probably could be allowed in Afghanistan or in the neighboring countries. They could be sent the money. Then there could be this barter system through which people could send.
That still works there.
It still works there. Also, when we are talking, of restrictions on the banking system, then I think it is essentially on the transfer of US dollars. I think there a way can be found out in helping them by sending them currencies to the banks, other than US dollars, like the Chinese currencies or currencies of other countries.
But they are under sanctions. How will they do it?
No, they are under sanctions. But this is what I'm saying. The sanction is that US dollars cannot be transferred to them.
No, it's not US dollars. I think
we
it's all
can
currency.
debate that. We can debate that.
It's all
that's wrong.
currency.
But this is what my understanding is, that NGOs would be able to benefit. And if you recall, when Ms. Wells were here in Pakistan,
Alice Wells, yes.
She was very encouraging, and she says the United States has no problem in disbursements of any kind of assistance by any country in the world, including the United States, to Afghanistan. So I think that gives a lot of room for people to exercise their right to help the people of Afghanistan in whatever way it is possible. You also talked about, who can, a very good question, who can influence the US government. I think it is the people of the United States alone who can influence them, apart from Israel. And it is the US media, who can influence them. And therefore, I think the OIC could probably, make efforts to make the people of the United States aware of the dangers of continuation of their present policies. They need to dig out once again the report of the 9/11 Commission, which has categorically stated that, one of the main reasons was that there was no US embassy in Afghanistan, in the 80s and when the Taliban were in power there. And therefore, they were totally unaware. They had zero presence there. Right now, again, the same thing is happening, that they have assigned this responsibility to their embassy in Qatar, in Doha, to look after their interests in Afghanistan. So it could actually lead to that. So I think the OIC itself could actually make that effort. There was this visit of the US Intelligence Committee persons to Pakistan only, I think, about 2 weeks back. They were, I think,
4 senators.
Yeah, they were briefed by the military and also, I think, by the Foreign Office. And I'm sure they would also take back now the dangers, of the continuation of the present policy of punishing the people of Afghanistan rather than the government. Because if you see in the past, whether it was in Iraq or any other countries of the world, sanctions never worked against the government. Even in Iran, it has never worked against the government. What happens is that, the people are affected and the public opinion goes against, the people and the government of the United States. These are some of the aspects that they need to consider. Again, we are talking of the collective influence of the OIC, although some countries for their own reason may not have been there. But the Secretary General is here, and I think he would know that, the OIC is representing 2 billion Muslims, having, combined GDP of $25 trillion, and they are having 3/4 of the world's oil and gas reserves. And many of them have very good relationship with the government of the United States. And I think if they use this influence with the government of the United States at all levels, with the White House, with the State Department, with the US military, I think we could hope to have a positive outcome.
But Jalsab, there is again a problem. The kind of influence the Indians have, that is also very, on the Muslim world, on the Gulf countries. Yes. We all know how Modi is treated out there. And when we ask for money, because beggars can't be choosers, I mean, we are responsible for our own wrongdoings, to be very honest. Now, Jalsab, do you think Indians are very clear about one thing? They want chaos in Afghanistan because that is what suits them. They believe as long as the Taliban factor is present, that is going to be, part and parcel with the Pakistani government or the military establishment, and that is not going to benefit India in any way, because whatever the designs the Indians had in Afghanistan or even still have, that cannot be fulfilled unless until Taliban are history. Number one. Right. Do you think the Indians would let it happen, sir? Let's be straight about it.
You see, you said they're wise people. I would say they're very cunning people. Why? Again, there is a different hypothesis than what you formulated, that one day they may surprise Pakistan and they may actually grant a recognition, of course, in cohort with the Americans and with the Russians and others, to beat Pakistan in its own game. They could do that. And if that happens, what is Pakistan going to do? So we cannot say anything. Secondly, I think the Indians have been told by the Americans that it is not in the interest of the United States that they should create more chaos in Afghanistan, and I think they cannot afford not to listen to the Americans. So hopefully, I think they would not continue to play the role of the spoilers as far as Afghanistan is concerned. And they've given some indication like wanting to send wheat to Afghanistan and things like that. One is not sure what is the real design of that, but one can only hope for the best because of the overall environment and because Russia also wants that there should be no chaos in Afghanistan, because if there is chaos, I think even Russia and the Central Asian republics, they will not be spared.
Very nice. Ma'am, your take on the same point?
Well, if we go into geopolitics and geoeconomics, it's a whole new ball game. There is also this view that India and the US may want Afghanistan to continue to simmer, because that would give them an opportunity to keep some kind of an eye and a presence there to ensure that China's western provinces continue to sort of have terrorism and separatism fueled there. They would have an opportunity to keep an eye on Iran, on Pakistan,
It
and
suits
on
them.
Russia. It suits them. So I think that debate is a totally different debate. I think right now with OIC meeting going on, we should try and focus on what we can do for Afghanistan. Pakistan is a founding member of the OIC.
Correct.
And one of its most important members also. And that is why I said it was a very good initiative for Pakistan to have this OIC meeting. And Pakistan is doing its best to try and help the Afghan people. It has been sending aid convoys to Afghanistan. But I am a little worried at seeing that there is actually no sort of popular sentiment to help the Afghan people here. I think the government at this time should seize the initiative and may want itself to appeal to the people of Pakistan also to contribute and provide humanitarian assistance. Here I would very strongly recommend that they don't include the NGOs and all, because that may lead us to another dimension, as we know. So maybe the government itself could conduct some initiatives and arrange some collection points in all over Pakistan, where general public can also contribute to the people of Afghanistan. And there's a reason why I am saying.
That's a very good point raised, ma'am.
There is a reason why I am saying this, because we have had our own tense relationship with Afghanistan. It's a long history, you know it well, I know it well. I don't have the time to repeat it here. But there has been this, blow hot, blow cold kind of a relationship with Afghanistan. But despite that, the politics of the bilateral relationship, there are the people of Pakistan and Afghanistan that feel for each other, that have this affinity of culture, of
Historical
religion,
relationship.
historical relationship. And I think, to use, an American terminology, but this is the time for Pakistan, for its long-term gain, to win the hearts and minds of the people of Afghanistan. Pakistan should step up its effort.
And I'm sure the government is pursuing that particular policy.
Yes, to step up its effort to reach out to the people of Pakistan. For example, there is a huge, schmoozle going on and huge hue and cry about the rights of women and the rights of the children. Pakistan has had a very successful program of the child and mother care units, healthcare units. Why can't we join hands with maybe China, with Russia, go there? And because, sorry to say, just let me complete. Because if we stop taking the human rights route and take the health care of mother and children into Afghanistan, handhold with regional countries, take that approach, that will actually empower the women of Afghanistan and may actually let the West see that it is, rights. Afghanistan was a democratic country.
I think this is a great opportunity also, because
this is a great opportunity.
Absolutely.
To go down that route.
Last comment from you. Closing remarks also. Askary sir.
Thank you very much. It has been a very enriching discussion here. I think on the question of India, it was ironical that it was on your television, or I think some other television. I suggested a month before India decided to send wheat through Pakistan that India and Pakistan should work together on economic cooperation. Forget about all the British geopolitics that have created the Kashmir problem and other problems. That there is a way for India to come back to its geo-economic and cultural environment. India is not an Atlantic country. There is an identity crisis in India. They want to have one feet in Asia, but the other feet in the Atlantic. And that is creating big problems for India. There is a reality which India cannot surpass, which is a geographical, cultural, historical situation. And this is a very good case of that geoeconomics is superior to geopolitics. And it was a welcome thing when I saw that your Prime Minister Imran Khan even accepted to allow the Indian wheat to go to Afghanistan, as I actually had suggested a month earlier. But then due to these sometimes quite silly geopolitical and other games, this did not go through. But I think this is a very good case where Pakistan's position in the region should be reinforced, but not by these games.
Absolutely.
But by
very important point raised, sir. Especially this particular action of Pakistan is also open up so many avenues for both these countries to at least start talking, start negotiating, because at the end of the day,
and
the
India
detention between Pakistan and India matters
India
for the
has
entire
everything
region.
to gain from working with Pakistan.
All right.
China.
All right, sir. Thank you so much, Askary sir, for your participation in the show. Ma'am, it was a pleasure having you, Jalal sir. Thank you so much for your time as well. And that's all we have for this particular hour. After this, you'll be having the main news bulletin, and our transmission is going to continue after that. Stay with us. Khuda Hafiz.
इसने ये नहीं कहा कि इंडिया की
देखिए जी।